We begin this hour with NBC News managing editor Carol Lee, Washington correspondent Yamiche Alcindor, Eugene Daniels, an MSNBC political contributor and White House correspondent at Politico, and former Democratic Senator from Alabama, Doug Jones. He's now at the Center for American Progress. So, Carol, you're behind some of this groundbreaking reporting from NBC News. Talk to us about what is being discussed within the Biden inner circle.
Well, there's a couple of things, Katie, when you talk about the family discussions that have been happening about what an exit, if the president were ultimately to decide that that's what he wanted to do, to suspend his campaign, what that would look like. And what we're told is that the discussions have focused on that they want it to be, an exit that would honor the decades that the president has spent serving public office. It's something that they would want for it to happen on his own time frame, on his own timeline, and also something that would be carefully crafted, that it's not something that would just be thrown together. And so those kinds of discussions are happening. And I guess you could think of it in this way. They're having those discussions while the president is still figuring out whether or not this is something he wants to do, so that there could be a plan for him if he does ultimately make that decision. And what we're told from a number of sources is that things have really shifted. That 3 weeks after the debate, when you talk to some of the same sources we've been talking to for 3 weeks, there's just a different tone and tenor to what they say. It's sort of, as you said, it's when, not if at this point. And they're trying to figure out exactly, what that looks like going forward. And at the same time, as you heard it there, the campaign and people around the president publicly are really pushing back and saying he is in this and he's not going anywhere, Katie.
How quickly could this plan come together?
That really depends. It could come together. We've talked to sources who are close to the president who've said this is something that could happen in days. It's all a matter of whether this is a decision that the president ultimately makes. If he does, there are a lot of preparations happening and planning happening to make that something, to have it ready to go for him if and when he gets there. And so it's any time that he feels like he's ready to do that. As you mentioned, he's at Rehoboth Beach at his house in Delaware. He's recovering from COVID. And so he's having certainly a lot of time to think about this and talk with various people about it. And one of the things that we know from our reporting, Katie, is that the people who are closest to him are still putting out phone calls to allies, people they trust, and kind of taking the temperature. What do you think? What's the atmosphere? What's the money like? Or how are donors feeling? They're still, poking and prodding and asking those questions. So it could happen at any time, but it also, could not happen ever, and it also could happen later than in the coming days.
All right. So as this is being discussed, a lot of the conversation is now turning to the Vice President, Kamala Harris. Yamiche, what can you tell us about her movements in the last few days and what she plans on doing?
Well, Vice President Kamala Harris is really delicately navigating what sources tell me is an awkward position for her. She's both having to be ready to be the top of the ticket at any moment, while also wanting to publicly and privately defend President Biden. She's making calls to allies, trying to make sure that they know that the president wants to stay in this race. But she's someone who, of course, is also now taking on more events because the president has been sidelined with his COVID diagnosis. So she's going to be holding a fundraiser in Massachusetts. She's also heading to Wisconsin. The campaign just put that out a few moments ago, that she's going to be heading to Wisconsin for a campaign event. So she's really stepping in here and trying to bolster the ticket no matter where she ends up. Now, people have told me that she is not wanting to be involved in sort of any planning when it comes to whether or not she could be the top of the ticket. But her allies are not waiting, Katie. There are a number of people who tell me that people close to her say that they are informally gathering and sort of mapping out what a campaign apparatus for her would look like. There's a lot of concern that she doesn't really have an organization set up. So they're talking about sort of the staff that they might hire, who they might fire on the Biden campaign. They're also talking about the path that she might have to victory and how that might look different from President Biden in particular. They're looking at the South, looking at Georgia and North Carolina and African-American voters and thinking whether or not that's where she should really be focusing instead of maybe a place like Wisconsin, I was told by one source just last night. There's also this idea that her allies have been doing polling and quietly doing research on sort of where she polls. I'm told that they were looking at sort of her role as one of the most prominent voices in the administration, the most prominent voice in the administration on the issue of reproductive rights and how that resonates with women voters. And also they say the polling shows that she does better among young voters while President Biden has struggled with them. So there's a lot going on behind the scenes for her allies, though I'm told the vice president at this moment is not involved in that. And in fact, she's just sort of trying to stay away from that. But there are a lot of people who want to see her at the top of the ticket and are readying to make the argument that she should not be passed over because she's vice president, but also because she's an African-American woman who speaks directly to the Democrats' base. Katie.
Talk about readying for Kamala Harris. Eugene Politico is reporting that the Trump campaign is readying themselves for a potential Kamala Harris situation at the top of the ticket.
Yeah, we're, being here in Milwaukee, trying to get out. As you can see, I'm in the airport with canceled flights. But what you hear from Republicans is this one concern that it might be Kamala Harris or anybody, right? Because they have been preparing for years to run against Joe Biden. That is the person that they are ready for. There's been extensive reporting about kind of their giddiness about going against Joe Biden once again, especially after that June 27th debate. And I talked to Governor Kristen Sununu of New Hampshire, not a fan or friend of the Trump folks, but even as just a Republican looking at Vice President Kamala Harris and saying her entrance into the race at the top of the ticket would completely change the dynamics, just like Amisha's talking about, right? Does the math look different? The electorate might look different. Now young voters might be more interested. You have a Democratic Party that's been kind of not excited about their nominee for a long time. Maybe they're excited again, right? These are the things that the Trump campaign and Republicans writ large are kind of looking at, thinking about, and more importantly, trying to ready themselves for. I will say, talking to delegates on the floor throughout the week, as the chips started to fall around President Biden, and it seemed more clear that he was possibly moving toward having to actually make the decision to drop out of that race, is people were not happy about it. Even the delegates were concerned, right? Like they were talking about Joe Biden a lot more at some times than even their own nominee as he was coming up. And so the concern amongst Republicans is that this could change things, and also more importantly for independents who have for a long time said they don't want a Trump Biden rematch. You give them someone else, and maybe that makes them much more excited to vote against Donald Trump.
Yeah, the anticipation of that, certainly. Senator, I know that you're not calling for Joe Biden to step aside. Correct me if I'm wrong on that. But if there were a deadline for Joe Biden and the party to make its final decision to stop having this conversation, either because he stays in the race or because he decides to get out of it, what is that deadline?
I don't know exactly what the deadline would be, but I know that, there were a lot of things that have happened since the debate, including a week full of NATO leaders in which President Biden showed the world that he can be a leader, is a leader, and can be a future leader for America and for the coalition that is fighting Vladimir Putin, unlike what we saw at the Republican National Convention, which seemed to be a Putin love fest over the last few days. I also know that the Republican Convention was not a time to make any kind of firm announcements. This was something, now that is over and the president is kind of isolated away, I think he's having that. You hear these conversations. And by the way, I don't think anything we just heard from your colleagues here is really newsworthy. I mean, these are logical things that are going on, both with the president and his family in discussions and alternatives that I believe were probably taking place several weeks ago, 2 or 3 weeks ago, not just in the last few days. Preparations. Kamala Harris has been prepared to be at the top of the ticket. She has been prepared to be president since the day she was selected by Joe Biden as his running mate. So it would be irresponsible for people not to do the kind of things given the atmosphere that we have now. But I do think you'll see something relatively soon. As they say on the game shows, final answer, I think will be there. And I think, as I've said all along, whatever that final answer is going to be, it is going to be one that I trust Joe Biden's judgment and will be in the best interest of the country.
Hey there, MSNBC fans. I'm Luke Russert, and be sure to join me, Rachel Maddow, Jen Psaki, Lawrence O'Donnell, Steve Kornacki, Joy Reid, and many more September 7th in Brooklyn MSNBC Live Democracy 2024. Click on the link for ticket information. We will see you there.